At an exclusive gala full of wealthy elites, an old black man was ridiculed, laughed at, and dismissed as just another nobody. But what if everything they thought they knew about him was a lie? What if, in the blink of an eye, this nobody turned out to be the one person everyone had been waiting for? What happens next will shock you. Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't believe, and it's unfolding right before your eyes. Don't miss the rest of this incredible story. Hit subscribe and stay tuned for more shocking reveals. George Harrison lived alone in a small apartment tucked between two aging buildings in a quiet part of the city. The walls were thin, the floors creaked with every step, but to George, it felt like home. He spent his days in this modest space, a place where time seemed to slow down and the outside world didn't quite matter. The apartment was filled with old books, dusty photographs, and the faint scent of cedar wood from a small dresser that had seen better days. George wasn't rich, nor was he poor. He was simply forgotten, a relic of another time when his name meant something. On this particular morning, he sat at a small kitchen table carefully reading the newspaper. His hands were steady, though aged, and his eyes, behind gold-rimmed glasses, scanned the columns with a quiet intensity. The world had changed since he was young, and though the headlines screamed about movements, revolutions, and the endless churn of progress, George felt a quiet resignation. He had lived through it all, from the marches to the speeches, from the glistening hope of change to the painful realization that much of it had been fleeting. He was a man of the past, but the world had moved on. And yet today felt different. Today, a letter had arrived, an invitation sealed with an emblem he hadn't seen in years. It was from the Dupri Foundation, one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the country. The invitation was simple, elegant, nothing like the heavy, ink-splattered letters George used to receive when he was a young man, fighting in the trenches of change. "You are invited to be our guest at the annual gala of the Dupri Foundation," it read. "We honor those who have contributed to the cause of social justice and community empowerment." The words stung him, both a reminder of who he was and who he had become. The foundation had grown into a prestigious entity, but George knew its roots. He had been there in its infancy, when the world still hadn't realized the magnitude of what was to come. He had helped to build the foundation in its most crucial years, long before the Dupri name had become synonymous with wealth and influence. And now, decades later, here was an invitation, a simple request for his presence among the elite. He placed the letter down, staring at it for a moment. There was no bitterness in his gaze, just an old man's resignation. Still, a part of him wondered whether they remembered who he truly was, or if they were simply inviting him out of politeness, like a distant memory resurfacing at an inconvenient time. After a brief pause, he decided he would go, not for them, but for himself, for the man he used to be. Later that evening, George stood in front of his mirror, adjusting the collar of his worn jacket. His reflection seemed foreign, a version of himself he didn't quite recognize anymore. The gray hairs at his temples had deepened, and his face, once sharp and full of purpose, had softened with age. Still, his posture remained straight, his gaze steady. There was something unyielding in the way he held himself, as if the weight of the years had only made him stronger. He reached for his cane, his constant companion these days, and with a small sigh, left the apartment. The Dupri Foundation's gala was being held at one of the city's most exclusive venues, a towering structure of glass and steel that gleamed like a monument to excess. As George made his way to the entrance, the surrounding streets seemed to hum with activity. The rich, the powerful, and the influential spilled out of expensive cars, their laughter and chatter filling the air like a soundtrack to a world he no longer belonged to. He stood at the entrance for a moment, watching the crowd, feeling the unfamiliar weight of this world. Inside, the event was everything he had imagined. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a cold, golden light over the room. The floors were polished marble, gleaming beneath the polished shoes of the guests. The walls were adorned with expensive art, each piece a conversation starter for those who could afford it. The guests mingled, exchanging pleasantries and business cards, their voices low and polite. No one noticed George as he entered, not at first. He moved quietly through the crowd, his cane tapping gently against the floor with each step. People passed him without a second glance, too absorbed in their own worlds to notice the elderly man in the simple suit. It wasn't until he reached the registration desk that anyone paid him any attention. A young woman, no older than 30, looked up from her paperwork with a small smile. She didn't recognize him at first, but the polite smile she gave him was enough to mask her confusion. "May I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice sweet but laced with the kind of forced politeness one reserves for those who don't quite fit into the surroundings. "I'm here for the gala," George replied, his voice steady. But there was an edge to it that the woman didn't catch. She checked the list before her, and her fingers paused over it, her smile faltering for just a moment. "And your name, sir?" she asked, her eyes flicking back and forth between George and the list. "George Harrison," he said, watching her closely. There was a long, awkward silence as the woman scanned the list again, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. George stood still, the weight of years and history pressing down on him as the moment stretched on. Finally, she looked up at him, her face a mix of embarrassment and politeness. "I'm afraid I don't see your name here," she said, her voice too loud now, as if trying to make the moment seem less uncomfortable. "But I can get someone to help you." George didn't flinch. He had faced worse in his life. He simply nodded and stepped aside, allowing the woman to disappear into the crowd. It wasn't long before someone else appeared, an older man dressed in an expensive tuxedo with a bored look in his eyes. "You here for the event?" he asked, his tone disinterested, as though he were asking if George had wandered in from the street. George gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that conveyed nothing but his own quiet amusement at the situation. "Yes," George said simply. "I was invited." The man glanced at him with a look that said he didn't quite believe it, but with a vague gesture, he led George deeper into the venue. He didn't ask any more questions, as if George's presence wasn't worth questioning. As they walked, George took in the scene around him. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the empty gestures of wealth and power. The room was full of people who had never known what it was like to struggle, to fight for something bigger than themselves. But George had. He had fought when it mattered. And if they didn't remember who he was, then perhaps it was time to remind them. As George moved deeper into the gala, he felt the air grow thicker, saturated with the perfume of wealth and self-importance. The chatter around him was a blur of names, deals, and the kind of empty promises only the affluent could make. He passed a group of well-dressed women laughing too loudly at a joke that probably wasn't funny, and a pair of men in bespoke suits discussing the latest investment opportunities, their voices rich with superiority. No one paid him any attention, save for the occasional passing glance, some curious, others dismissive. George's eyes wandered around the room, noticing the polished surfaces, the gleam of crystal, the gleam of faces that had never seen real struggle. This was a world he no longer understood, if he ever had. He couldn't help but compare it to the world he had once fought for, the world of grassroots movements, long meetings, marches that had not been for show but for the very survival of ideals. He had been one of the voices that carried those ideals, not the ones who capitalized on them once the fight was won. He was interrupted from his thoughts by a soft voice calling his name. "Mr. Harrison?" He turned, his gaze landing on a young woman who was holding a clipboard and looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and faint surprise. She had a warm smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile you give when you're not quite sure who someone is, but feel obligated to act as though you do. "Mr. Harrison, welcome. I'm Rebecca Langston, the event coordinator," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that was meant to be polite but almost stiff. She was younger than he expected, mid-20s, sharp features, and dressed in a designer dress that screamed modern ambition. She held the clipboard like a shield, the way someone who was trying too hard might. "Thank you," George replied, his tone even. But there was something behind his eyes, something that suggested he was less interested in pleasantries and more in observing her. His hand gripped his cane slightly tighter, as if the weight of the moment settled in. "I didn't realize I'd need an escort." Rebecca laughed lightly, though there was a hint of nervousness in it. "Oh no, of course not. But we just like to make sure everyone is, well, comfortable. Please allow me to show you to your seat." She began to walk and George followed, noting the way she moved, quick, purposeful, yet with a certain air of distance. There was something almost rehearsed in her actions, as if she had learned how to behave in such settings, but had never fully internalized the purpose behind it. As they walked past tables full of well-dressed guests, George's ears picked up fragments of their conversations, empty chatter about the latest fashion, the state of the economy, personal anecdotes that seemed to carry no weight. In a sense, the conversations felt like a soundtrack to a movie George had long since stopped watching. He had lived through real change, real history, and now all this seemed like a game. He couldn't help but think of the times he had walked through similar rooms, decades ago, in the heart of movements that had meant something. Where were those voices now? Rebecca finally stopped at a table near the center of the room, where a small group of middle-aged men and women sat, their laughter tinkling like glass. One of them, a man with thick gray hair and an air of quiet authority, looked up when they arrived. His eyes landed on George, a flicker of recognition flashing briefly across his face before he hid it behind a polite smile. "Mr. Harrison, this is William Dupri," Rebecca said, her voice smoothing over the introduction like a professional who had memorized the names of every important person in the room. "He's one of our most generous donors and the backbone of tonight's event." William Dupri stood up, extending his hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes were calculating, as if he were sizing up the man in front of him. "A pleasure, Mr. Harrison," he said, though there was an odd edge to his words, as though he were unsure whether he should be addressing a staff member or a guest. "I must say, it's not often we see someone of your distinction at these events. I assume you're here to represent your community?" George, feeling the sting of the subtle jab, gave a slow, controlled smile. "I'm here because I was invited," he replied, his voice steady. "And I've always believed that an invitation, once extended, should be honored." William chuckled, though the laughter didn't quite reach his eyes. Of course, you've got a good point there. A good man always honors his invitations." His gaze lingered on George a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to puzzle out something hidden behind the man's calm exterior. "Well, it's certainly an honor to have you join us tonight." George didn't respond immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to hang in the air between them. The tension was palpable, like a cord stretched tight, waiting for the right moment to snap. Finally, he nodded slightly and took a seat at the table, the weight of his presence subtly shifting the dynamic in the room. He could sense the others around the table trying to place him, to figure out who he really was. Most of them looked at him with polite indifference, the kind of look you give someone you don't recognize but feel obligated to acknowledge. As the evening unfolded, George found himself a spectator in his own life, watching as people moved around him, laughing and shaking hands, discussing things that didn't matter to him. He was the quiet observer, the man whose past was heavy with memories of battles fought and won, while the present felt like a shadow of those ideals. His mind drifted again to the past, to the times when he had been a part of something bigger, when his name had mattered. But he had learned over the years that the world, particularly the world of the elite, had a way of erasing the contributions of those who didn't fit the narrative they wished to tell. One of the women at the table, a young socialite in a glittering dress, leaned toward George with a bright fake smile. "So, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice light and airy, "how did you end up in this line of work? I mean, you look like you've seen some things, right?" Must have quite the story to tell. George looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He could see the curiosity in her eyes, but also the insincerity. She didn't care about his story. She wanted to hear something that made her feel more important. He almost felt sorry for her, but then with a small tilt of his head, he responded, his voice low but with a weight that made her stop in her tracks. "I didn't get into this for the stories," he said quietly. "I did it because it had to be done. Stories come after the fact when people like you start writing them." There was a pause, and for a moment, the room grew quieter. The woman didn't know how to respond, and neither did anyone else at the table. George felt their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. He knew who he was, even if they didn't. But before anyone could say anything more, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, everyone, we're about to begin." The announcement came from the front of the room, where a tall, well-dressed man had taken the stage. His voice was confident, but the tension in the room was palpable. All eyes turned to him, and George could hear the soft murmur of the guests as they began to rise, shifting their attention toward the podium. It was time. And George, still seated at his table, couldn't help but wonder if anyone would recognize him once the evening truly began. The moment the man at the podium began speaking, the room seemed to shift. Conversations died down, and the murmur of polite applause rippled through the crowd like the calm before a storm. The air hummed with anticipation. Everyone stood in expectant silence, their eyes now glued to the stage. George remained seated, watching quietly, his hands folded over his cane. He wasn't in a rush to stand, not yet. He had lived through too many grandiose speeches to be moved by them now. The speaker, a tall man with a slick smile, introduced himself as the evening's master of ceremonies, a key figure behind the Dupri Foundation's charitable efforts. His voice was smooth, dripping with the kind of practiced charm that came from years in the spotlight. He spoke about philanthropy, about changing the world through money, influence, and networks, an echo of a message George had heard many times before, though it felt hollow in this room. "As we gather tonight," the speaker continued, "we stand on the shoulders of giants, those who have fought for justice, for equality, for freedom. It is because of their tireless efforts that we are here today. Tonight, we honor the legacy of these great men and women." George listened intently, his brow furrowing slightly. The words felt familiar, like the opening lines of a script someone had memorized without understanding the weight behind them. He had seen these people, heard them speak, watched them claim credit for causes they had never truly understood. His mind flickered back to the days when he had stood on the front lines of real change, when those same speeches had been made by people who truly believed in the work. And now, they were just words. The speaker paused for dramatic effect, looking down at his notes with a touch of reverence before continuing. "And tonight, we are honored to have among us a true champion of justice, a person whose work has shaped the very foundation of our mission. I won't keep you in suspense any longer. Please, let us welcome the man whose vision built this organization, the heart of our cause, our guest of honor for the evening, Mr. George Harrison." The name hung in the air like a question mark. George's eyes narrowed slightly as he heard the speaker's words, and for a moment, there was a long, confusing pause in the room. The applause was hesitant, unsure of how to react. The guests looked around at each other, whispering in confusion. Some smiled politely, clearly unaware of who George was or why his name was being brought up in such a context. For a moment, George felt a stir of something old, something like the past rising up in him. It wasn't pride, it wasn't anger, it was just recognition. The world had changed, but in that moment, it felt as though his history had come alive again. They had called him to the stage, but none of them truly understood who he was. They didn't know what his name meant, or what his presence here might mean for them. The spotlight shifted slightly, casting long shadows over the room as George slowly stood. His cane tapped softly against the floor with each step, a rhythmic sound that contrasted sharply with the tense silence in the air. Rebecca Langston, who had been standing near the back, froze for a moment when she saw George rise. She had been standing by, waiting for the formal presentation to begin, but the moment she laid eyes on him, her face shifted from polite curiosity to confusion. She glanced at the crowd, her mind racing. This couldn't be right. Was this the same man? The one they had brought here for the gala? The man whose name had been listed on no guest list? She glanced at her clipboard again, checking, then checked again. There it was. No mistake. It was the same man, George Harrison. But the name didn't fit the man, or at least not the man she had imagined. She took a few hurried steps forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and caught up with George just before he reached the podium. "Mr. Harrison," she said, trying to steady her voice. "We weren't expecting you yet. The event isn't officially—" "I know," George said, cutting her off softly but with a firm certainty. "But it's time." Rebecca blinked, taken aback by his quiet authority. She couldn't quite place it. The way he moved, the weight of his presence, the stillness of the room around him. He wasn't an old man shuffling in the background. He was someone. But she still couldn't figure out exactly who. She glanced at the speaker, who was watching the exchange, his face tight with growing discomfort. "Shall I introduce you again, Mr. Harrison?" the MC asked, his voice tinged with an undercurrent of anxiety now, the seamless confidence that had carried his earlier speech slipping. "No need," George said, his voice calm and assured. "I'll speak for myself." Without waiting for another word, George stepped forward and took the microphone from the podium. The crowd fell silent, unsure of what to expect. Rebecca, still standing at the side, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. There was something about the way he held himself, something ancient and unyielding, like he was about to unravel a truth no one was prepared to hear. For a long moment, George said nothing. He simply stood there, looking out at the sea of faces. The light from the chandeliers cast long shadows across the room, but it was his gaze that commanded the room's attention. It was a quiet, steady gaze that held the weight of years, of movements fought and forgotten. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but filled with a kind of unspoken power. "Tonight," George began, "you will hear a lot of talk about justice, about equality, about causes worth fighting for." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces before him, some unsure, others uncomfortable. "You will hear about the names of people who did what they had to do to make this world better. But let me tell you something you may not know, something they won't tell you tonight. The people you honor, the people you celebrate, well, they are standing here in front of you. Not in the names you know, not in the ones who have been written into history. No, they are in the ones who built the foundation when no one else could be bothered, when the lights were dim and the cameras weren't rolling." The room was silent, the kind of silence that feels too heavy, as if something unseen was shifting beneath it all. George's words hung in the air, and for the first time that night, the audience seemed to be truly listening. There was no applause, no polite murmurs, just an almost palpable tension, like a string pulled tight. George continued, his voice steady but carrying the weight of truth. "I'm not here to bask in accolades. I'm not here for you to congratulate me on a job well done. I'm here because my work, and the work of many like me, built the very cause you now stand behind. And most of you don't even know it. You're too busy chasing your next deal, too busy enjoying the fruits of what we bled for." Rebecca felt her heart race in her chest as George spoke. There was no anger in his tone, no bitterness, but the truth of it rang in the air like a bell, clear and unshakable. She could see it now, the way his presence in the room wasn't accidental. He was not just a guest, he was the foundation. The quiet hum of realization began to spread through the room, but before anyone could process what George had said, another voice cut in. William Dupri, who had been standing silently at the back, suddenly stepped forward. His face was flushed, his smile strained. He clapped his hands together, awkwardly trying to pull the evening back into its well-worn groove. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice tinged with nervousness, "it seems we have a slight misunderstanding. Perhaps we should—" But George raised his hand, a gesture that silenced the room. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Dupri. Only truths that are being uncovered." And with that, George turned and walked slowly back to his seat, leaving behind a room full of uncomfortable silence, unsure of what they had just witnessed, but certain that something was about to shift, something they were not yet ready to understand. The silence that followed George's words lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. People exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to proceed. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and beneath it lay a truth no one was ready to confront. Rebecca, standing at the edge of the room, felt her stomach churn. She could hear the soft murmur of voices, a low buzz of speculation and confusion. But nothing had changed. Not yet. Not for them. William Dupri, still standing near the back of the room, shifted uncomfortably. He had been in these situations before. High-profile events, awkward moments, even some small crises. But this was different. George Harrison had just disrupted the entire evening, and Dupri wasn't sure how to recover from it. The crowd was restless, waiting for something to break the tension. But nothing came. George sat back down at his table, his cane resting beside him. His gaze didn't leave the front of the room, where the MC was still standing, awkwardly shuffling his papers. There was no apology, no attempt to smooth over what had just transpired. The guests around George were still frozen in their seats, unsure of what was expected of them. No one knew whether to clap, to pretend that nothing had happened, or to simply sit in quiet reflection. The whole room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. Finally, the MC cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone weak but trying to reclaim some semblance of control. "We will now continue with the evening's events. Please enjoy the dinner, and we'll reconvene shortly for the awards ceremony." The crowd hesitated for a moment before the murmurs began again, low and uncertain. The music started up again, a soft classical piece that was supposed to soothe the mood, but it only made the discomfort more pronounced. George could hear the quiet hum of conversation, but it wasn't the usual polite chatter. This time, people weren't talking about investments or the latest fashion trends. They were talking about him, about what he had said, about who he really was. The realization had begun to settle in. The man in front of them wasn't just some forgotten relic of the past. He was a part of it, a man whose name held weight, whose presence demanded respect, whether they liked it or not. Rebecca stood by the edge of the stage, watching the room unravel in subtle ways. The confidence with which George had spoken, it wasn't just the words, it was the delivery, the quiet power in his voice. She felt something shift inside her, a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Guilt. Her eyes flicked over to the guest list she had been holding so tightly. George Harrison's name wasn't listed, but his presence, his truth, was undeniable. She had assumed, like everyone else, that he was just another relic, a forgotten figure who had come to collect a token acknowledgement for a life that had long since passed. But now, standing there, she realized how little she truly knew. At the table, George was aware of the attention he was drawing. He didn't need to look around to feel it. He could hear the hushed whispers, the eyes that darted his way. He could almost hear the questions in their minds. Who is this man? Why was he invited? The young woman earlier had asked him where he had come from, and now he could almost hear her trying to piece together the fragments of a life he had lived. His mind drifted back to those days, when he had fought alongside the people who had founded the Dupri Foundation. Back when social justice had meant more than corporate donations and gala dinners. Back when they had marched in the streets, their voices echoing in unison, their feet pounding the pavement with the weight of a cause that wasn't just about changing laws, but about changing hearts. It wasn't long before Rebecca made her way back to him, her steps quick and uncertain. She paused for a moment at the edge of his table, hesitating. George didn't look up. He knew she was there. He could feel her presence, a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and a touch of fear. The whole night had shifted, and she was trying to make sense of it. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. I didn't know." George raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. He had heard similar words before from people who had realized their mistake too late, from people who had looked at him with suspicion and then, once they realized who he was, turned their attention away, as if they were somehow ashamed to have dismissed him in the first place. "I thought you were just—" Rebecca caught herself, her words suddenly faltering. "I thought you were just someone invited out of courtesy." "And now?" George asked, his voice low but direct. She paused, clearly uncomfortable, but her eyes softened as she took a seat across from him. "I was wrong," she said quietly. I didn't know. I didn't know what you'd done, what you meant to the foundation." George didn't smile, but there was a faint glimmer in his eyes. "That's the problem, isn't it? People only recognize you once the work is done, when the cause has already been fought and the victory has been claimed by others." Rebecca swallowed, her throat tight. She wasn't prepared for this, not at all. She had thought she understood the world she was a part of, had assumed that people like George Harrison were just old, irrelevant names. But now, in the quiet of their conversation, she was starting to understand that the world she moved in had a lot of blind spots. People like George were not forgotten because they were irrelevant. They were forgotten because others had stolen their stories and rebranded them. They had become footnotes in a narrative that no longer cared to remember the struggle. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't invited to speak," George replied. His eyes met hers, calm yet piercing. "I wasn't invited to share my story. I'm just here, like everyone else, to watch you all claim the fruits of what we fought for." Rebecca opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know how to respond. She didn't know what to do with the truth that had been handed to her so plainly. The reality was too complicated, too layered to untangle in a single conversation. She felt the weight of it, the gravity of everything George was telling her. The world she had known, the world she had built her career in, suddenly felt hollow. As she sat there, her gaze dropped to the floor, her mind racing to make sense of it all. The gala continued around them, but it no longer seemed like the event it had been just hours ago. The guests were still laughing, still eating, still pretending to live in a world that had no room for the men and women who had bled to build it. But George, for the first time in a long while, felt something stir inside him, a faint flicker of the purpose he had once carried with him. The battle was far from over. They hadn't won yet, not by a long shot, and if they didn't see that, he would make sure they did. The evening wasn't about recognition, not for him. It never had been, but it was time for a reckoning. Time for them to remember, time for them to understand who had built the very foundations they were now standing on. Rebecca sat in silence, the realization sinking in. Something had shifted tonight, and whether she wanted to or not, she had just become part of a story that was much bigger than the one she had been told. The evening dragged on, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The once lavish gala now felt like a facade, polished on the outside but hollow within. George remained quiet, observing everything and everyone around him with a sharpness that came from years of being overlooked, of being underestimated. He had seen this play before, watched as the powerful smiled and exchanged pleasantries while the rest of the world continued to struggle, unnoticed, underfoot. But tonight, something felt different. Tonight, the air in the room was charged with the undercurrent of something about to break. Rebecca sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken much since their conversation, and George hadn't pressed her to. She was wrestling with a truth that felt too big for her to understand all at once. The gentle hum of conversation at the other tables had returned, but it wasn't the same. People were speaking more quietly now, casting occasional glances in George's direction, as if unsure whether to acknowledge him or continue pretending that the evening was simply an expensive diversion from real life. The first course was served, a delicate arrangement of smoked salmon and caviar, its elegance in stark contrast to the growing tension in the room. George poked at the food absent-mindedly, his appetite having long since fled. His eyes, however, never stopped moving, taking in every small detail, every nuance of the crowd's reaction. They were all pretending to enjoy the evening. They were all pretending this was just another charity event. But they were uncomfortable now. There was no more pretending. A waiter passed by, offering wine to the guests, and Rebecca hesitated before accepting a glass. She took a small sip, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. She was still processing what had happened, what George had said. She had seen these kinds of people all her life. The Dupris, the patrons, the donors. They were supposed to be the ones with the answers, the ones who shaped the world with their money and influence. But George Harrison? He was a relic, wasn't he? Just an old man, forgotten by time and circumstance. Except he wasn't. And that was the problem. "Are you all right?" George's voice, though low, cut through her thoughts with precision. He was still looking at her, his gaze piercing but not unkind. Rebecca looked up at him, her expression conflicted. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She had been so sure of herself before, so sure of the world she inhabited. But now everything felt fragile. How could she have been so blind? How could they all have been so blind? "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I didn't know. I thought you were just here for the show. I thought you were part of the spectacle." George smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only a quiet understanding. "You thought I was a relic, a name to put on a guest list so you could pretend to honor me." His voice softened slightly. "You weren't the only one." She felt a sting at his words, but she couldn't deny their truth. She had been a part of the system, had played her part in keeping it intact. She had never questioned it, never really seen the cracks until now. It was as if, with a single sentence, George had peeled away the veneer she had spent years building and showed her the rot beneath. "I'm not here for your pity, Rebecca," George continued, his voice steady. "I'm not here for your apologies either. I'm here because there's something you need to know. Something you all need to know." Rebecca sat straighter in her seat, her attention fully on him now. She didn't know what to expect, but she felt the weight of his words pressing down on her, heavy and unrelenting. "What do you mean?" George's eyes seemed to soften, just for a moment, before he spoke again. "This foundation, the money that's been raised, the accolades and speeches you all love to make, it's all built on the backs of people who have long since been forgotten. People who were never meant to be remembered, whose names never made it into history books or award speeches." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "You mean, people like you?" George nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on her. "People like me. People who fought the fight when no one else would. People who bled for causes they didn't understand, and in the end were used to further someone else's agenda." She shook her head, almost in disbelief. "But the Dupri Foundation, it's doing good work, isn't it? It's giving back, it's raising awareness." "It's raising awareness," George said, his voice sharp now. "But for what? For whom? Who gets to decide which cause is worthy of attention? Who gets to profit off of the work we did, the sacrifices we made?" Rebecca opened her mouth to speak, but was interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps approaching. William Dupri, looking as composed as ever, but with a tightness around his mouth, walked up to the table. The moment he stepped close, George straightened slightly in his chair, but his expression remained calm. "I see we're having an enlightening conversation," William said, his voice carefully neutral. He glanced at Rebecca, who was still visibly shaken, then turned his gaze back to George. "Is everything all right, Mr. Harrison? You're causing quite a stir, I must say." George studied him for a moment, his eyes sharp but unreadable. "I'm not here to make friends, Dupri. I'm here because you and your friends have forgotten something important." William stiffened at the words, but he masked it quickly with a thin smile. "I'm sure I have no idea what you mean, but I must say we were all looking forward to the award ceremony. Perhaps it's best we don't linger on the past too much. Some things are better left forgotten, don't you think? Rebecca looked between the two men, feeling the tension in the air. There was a history here, a long, complicated history that neither man seemed willing to let go of. The past was no longer something to be celebrated or honored. It was a raw wound, something still very much alive and painful. George leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving William's face. The past is never truly forgotten, Dupri. It just gets buried under the lies people tell themselves. The truth has a way of coming to light, whether you want it to or not. William's smile tightened, but there was no humor in it. We'll see, Mr. Harrison. We'll see. But I would suggest you keep that in mind before you decide to stir up any more trouble. With that, William turned and walked away, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The moment he was out of earshot, Rebecca let out a shaky breath, her mind still spinning. "What was that about?" she whispered, more to herself than to George. George didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared after William, his gaze unwavering. "That, Rebecca, was the game. The one you're playing. The one you don't even realize you're a part of. But you're starting to see it now, aren't you?" Rebecca didn't respond immediately. She didn't know what to say. She had spent her whole life in a world where the powerful controlled the narrative, shaped the past, and decided who got to be remembered. But George had opened her eyes to a deeper truth, one she wasn't sure she was ready to confront. For the first time that night, George allowed himself a small smile, not one of triumph but of quiet recognition. He had spoken his truth, and now it was out there. What they did with it, what Rebecca did with it, was no longer his concern. It was theirs. The evening wore on, the sharp edge of tension still hanging in the air despite the continued flow of wine and conversation. The music had changed to a livelier tempo, an attempt to bring the mood back to its original lightness. But no one seemed to be fooled. It was as though a ripple had disturbed the surface of the evening, and now everyone in the room was looking at each other through a new lens, a lens that wasn't so easily wiped away. Rebecca couldn't shake the weight of George's words. She tried to immerse herself back into the rhythm of the event, smiling politely at the guests around her, nodding along with their conversations. But all the while, her thoughts kept circling back to him, the man who had disrupted the entire evening with a few quiet but devastating truths. She hadn't realized how deeply his words had penetrated until now. She glanced across the room at George, who was sitting at the same table, unmoving, like a statue in the middle of a bustling crowd. His stillness was almost unnerving, his gaze directed somewhere beyond the room, as if his mind had wandered to places far beyond the polished hall they were in. She couldn't help but feel an odd mixture of admiration and fear. The people around her had returned to their usual chatter, but she couldn't engage in it. The superficiality of it all, how easily they danced around the discomfort of their privilege, made her feel claustrophobic. She had always prided herself on being a part of this world, of knowing how to navigate it with grace and confidence. But now, every smile she forced felt like a lie. Every laugh, every passing comment seemed so meaningless in light of what George had revealed. The charade was no longer something she could participate in without questioning it. She excused herself from the conversation she was in and made her way toward the bar, her footsteps quick, purposeful. The bartender, a young man with dark-rimmed glasses, smiled at her but said nothing as she approached. She ordered a glass of bourbon and took it in one swift gulp, savoring the burn as it went down. She leaned against the bar, trying to steady herself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and for a moment, she debated whether to check it. It was probably just a message from one of the committee members or an update on the Foundation's latest project, something to pull her back into the comfortable realm of corporate charity work that she had become so familiar with. But her mind, restless and uneasy, wouldn't let her ignore it. She pulled out the phone and unlocked it, her fingers moving automatically as she checked the screen. "William Dupri wants to see you in his office. ASAP." The message was blunt, its urgency clear. Rebecca sighed, staring at the message for a few moments longer than she should have. It was the last thing she wanted to deal with right now, She had no doubt that Dupri wanted to have a word about the incident with George. He would want to smooth things over, put the evening back on track, and maybe silence any further questions about the past. She could already imagine the conversation. But something in her gut twisted, a gut feeling that told her this wouldn't be a simple corporate chat. Not anymore. Reluctantly, she slipped the phone back into her purse and made her way toward the back hallway. The space was quieter here, the hum of the gala muffled by the thick walls. The dim lighting made the hallway feel smaller, more intimate. When she reached the door to William's office, she hesitated. Her hand rested on the doorknob for a moment, and she almost turned away, but she didn't. She had come this far after all. She had to see this through. She knocked lightly before entering. William sat behind a large, sleek desk, his fingers steepled as he looked up at her with a tight smile. His face was more composed now, the outward unease from earlier gone, replaced by the controlled mask he always wore. But there was something else in his eyes, something colder than usual. "Rebecca," he said, his voice smooth but edged with an underlying tension. "I'm glad you could join me." She didn't respond immediately, unsure how to begin. Instead, she took a seat in the chair opposite his, her posture stiff. There was something about the way he watched her, as though he were trying to decipher her every move, every thought. "You're wondering why I asked for you to come here," William continued, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. "It's about tonight, about Mr. Harrison." Rebecca met his gaze, her heart racing. "What about him?" "Don't play coy, Rebecca," William said with a small, controlled smile. "You heard what he said. You saw how the room reacted. And you saw how I reacted. The last thing I need is for this event to devolve into some public spectacle. This evening was supposed to be about our foundation, about our work. We can't afford distractions." "I'm not sure I understand," Rebecca replied carefully. "You can't just dismiss what George said. There's a truth in his words, William, a truth that no one here seems willing to face." William leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Rebecca, we both know that truth isn't always convenient, and sometimes it's not the truth that matters. It's the story we tell, the narrative we create. That's what people remember, not the history behind the foundation, not the blood, sweat, and tears of the people who built it." "Are you saying we should just ignore it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung between them like an accusation. William's smile didn't falter, but his eyes grew colder. "What I'm saying is that George Harrison is an old man with an old story, a man whose relevance has long since passed. You and I both know that, Rebecca. And frankly, if he continues down this path, we're going to have a problem, one that could hurt the foundation and everything we've built here." Rebecca swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She had worked with William for years, but this was different. She had always believed in the work they did, their work. She had always justified her role in this world, thinking it was all part of something greater. But now it felt like she had been living in a carefully constructed lie. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I want you to keep this under control," William said, his voice firm, final. "We cannot afford to let this conversation spiral out of hand. I need you to manage George Harrison, keep him quiet, and if he continues to be a problem, then we'll have to deal with it in another way." Rebecca felt a chill run through her at the last part of his sentence. There was no mistaking what William meant. He wasn't just talking about smoothing things over. He was talking about silencing George, one way or another. For the first time in her career, Rebecca found herself questioning her place in this world. She looked at William, who was sitting there poised and confident, as though nothing had changed. And then, she thought about George, a man who had been part of something much bigger than this, something real, something raw. And now he was here, his truth forcing her to confront everything she had been too blind to see before. "I need time to think," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper, as she stood from the chair. "Of course," William replied, his voice smooth again as if the conversation hadn't just taken a dark turn. But don't take too long. The foundation needs you to stay focused on the big picture. We can't afford any distractions." As she walked out of the office, Rebecca's mind raced. She wasn't sure what she was going to do, but one thing was clear. This evening had changed everything. And it wasn't just about George anymore. It was about the foundation. It was about the choices she would have to make. Choices that could change the entire course of her life. And for the first time in a long time, Rebecca didn't know where she stood. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Rebecca. She moved through the gala like a ghost, her mind too full to focus on the elegant conversations or the clinking of silverware. The weight of William's words pressed on her like a stone in her chest, suffocating her every thought. He had made it clear what he wanted, what they all wanted. But something inside her had snapped. She couldn't just go back to the comfortable, predictable world of charity galas and foundation work. Not after what she had learned tonight. George Harrison's face kept flashing in her mind. His calm demeanor, his quiet defiance. His words had been an accusation, but they had also been a wake-up call. The more she thought about them, the more her stomach churned. The lies, the manipulation, the way they had all been complicit in rewriting history to suit the narrative they wanted to tell. She had thought she was part of something good, something noble. But now she saw it for what it was, a machine built on the sweat and sacrifices of people who had long been forgotten. As the evening drew to a close, Rebecca found herself standing near the back exit, looking out over the city skyline. The lights below twinkled like 1,000 tiny lies, each one more convincing than the last. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she felt the pull of the night, the need to get away from the chaos and the carefully constructed world of the gala. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from George. "Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th, midnight. You need to see something." The message was simple, direct, and it felt like a summons. Rebecca hesitated for a moment, her heart racing. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. Not now. Not after everything. She glanced around the room one last time, searching for William's figure, but he was nowhere to be seen. She didn't have much time. She had made a decision in that office. Whatever path she chose next, it wouldn't be dictated by William Dupri or the Foundation. It was time to find out what was really going on, to understand the truth in its rawest form. As she stepped out of the building and into the cool night air, Rebecca's thoughts raced. The city felt different tonight, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. The old warehouse on 5th wasn't far from where the gala had been held, but it felt like a world apart. As Rebecca drove through the city streets, her mind kept returning to George's words. People like me. People who fought the fight when no one else would. George hadn't just been talking about the past. He had been talking about the present, about the things that were still wrong, about the battle that was ongoing, whether the people in that room recognized it or not. When she pulled up to the warehouse, the building loomed in front of her, an imposing structure of brick and steel, abandoned long ago by whatever industry had once used it. The parking lot was empty, save for a few scattered cars, and the streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Rebecca took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest as she stepped out of the car. She was alone, and everything about this place felt foreign, unsettling. The warehouse seemed to stretch on endlessly, the windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring back at her. She walked toward the entrance, a heavy feeling settling in her gut. What could George possibly want to show her here? What was he trying to prove? As she pushed open the creaky metal door, the air inside hit her like a wave, damp, musty, and thick with the smell of decay. The inside was dark, save for a few dimly lit bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The space was vast, filled with old crates, broken machinery, and piles of discarded debris. It looked like something out of a forgotten era, abandoned and left to rot. And there, standing in the center of it all, was George. He was leaning against one of the crates, his back straight, his eyes focused on her with the intensity she had come to recognize. He wasn't smiling, but there was an almost imperceptible sense of relief in his posture, like he had been waiting for this moment. "You came," he said quietly, his voice echoing in the silence of the warehouse. Rebecca swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "What is this place?" George nodded toward the far side of the room, where a large tarp covered something bulky. "This is where it all started, where people like me, people who fought for real change, are buried, not in the history books, not in the speeches, but right here, in places like this." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes tracing the shadows, her mind racing with questions. "What do you mean?" George walked over to the tarp and lifted it, revealing a collection of dusty old boxes and filing cabinets. They were packed with papers, old records, photographs, everything that had been lost to time. "These," he said, pulling one of the boxes open. "These are the real stories, the ones the world forgot, the ones that Dupri and his friends don't want you to know." Rebecca stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. The papers inside the box were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. As her fingers skimmed over the documents, she saw names she had never heard before. People who had fought for equality, for justice, for real change, but whose contributions had been erased, replaced by polished narratives that suited the people in power. "This is," she started, but her voice trailed off. She didn't know what to say. The weight of the past, of what had been hidden and distorted, was overwhelming. George watched her closely, his eyes never leaving her face. "This is the truth, Rebecca, the one they've buried so they can control the story. You wanted to know why I'm here. It's not for the accolades or the recognition. It's to make sure the truth doesn't stay buried forever." Rebecca felt a sudden surge of anger rise within her, sharp and raw. All these years, she had been part of a system that erased the people who had made real sacrifices, the people who had fought, not for fame, not for status, but for the change they believed in. "I want to help," she said suddenly, her voice firm, the decision settling inside her like a stone. "I want to make sure people know. I can't just walk away from this." George nodded slowly, his expression softening. "It's not about making noise, Rebecca. It's about making sure the right people hear it." The words hung in the air between them, charged with a quiet intensity. Rebecca knew what she had to do now. The choice was no longer about fitting into the world she had known. It was about stepping into the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how dangerous it might be. And as the night stretched on, the weight of the past and the future settled over her like a heavy cloak. This was just the beginning. But she was ready. The silence in the warehouse was suffocating as Rebecca stood there, her hands trembling slightly as she held the faded documents in her hands. The weight of the truth was both a burden and a release. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was seeing the world for what it truly was, not through the lens of carefully constructed stories or curated narratives, but in its raw, unvarnished form. The people who had come before her, who had been erased from history, discarded like so much detritus, had fought for something real, something meaningful. And she had been complicit in their erasure. Her gaze flicked to George, who stood across from her, watching with a quiet intensity. There was no judgment in his eyes, just a steady understanding, as though he had been waiting for this moment, for her to see the truth, to accept the burden of what it meant. "I don't know what to do with this," Rebecca whispered, her voice unsteady. Her mind was racing, the enormity of the decision weighing heavily on her chest. She had been given a choice, her loyalty to William Dupri, to the foundation, to the narrative they had all constructed, or the truth that now lay before her in these boxes. "You don't have to decide tonight," George said, his voice calm but insistent. "But you will have to decide soon. The people you work for, the Dupris of the world, they won't let this go. They'll bury it again if they can. Rebecca clenched her fists, the sharp edges of the paper cutting into her skin. She had known that her path was never going to be easy. She had known that the moment she started to question the world she had been part of, there would be no going back. But she hadn't expected it to feel this heavy, this suffocating. The stakes were higher now. Everything was at risk. "So what now?" she asked, lifting her eyes to meet his. "What do you want me to do with all of this?" George took a step closer, his expression softening. "I want you to help me make sure the truth is heard. Not just in whispers, but loudly. We need to bring this to the people who are still fighting, to the ones who don't have the luxury of pretending it's all just a game. We need to remind them that their fight isn't over. It never was." Rebecca felt a surge of determination run through her. She had always been good at following orders, at playing the game, but now the game had changed. She wasn't just a cog in the machine anymore. She had the power to reshape the story. She had the power to take the truth that had been buried and make it impossible to ignore. "But how do we do that?" she asked, her voice stronger now, more certain. "How do we make them listen? The Dupris, the board, the donors, they all have too much control. They won't let us change anything." George gave a dry chuckle. "You're right, they won't let you change anything. But we can, together. We can't fight them head on, not yet. But we can start small. Start with the people who need to hear the truth most. The ones who've been forgotten. The ones whose sacrifices are buried beneath the weight of other people's greed. If we can get the right stories into the right hands, if we can make them see the people who've been erased, the whole narrative will crack. And once it cracks, it's over for them." Rebecca nodded slowly, her mind already working, turning over the possibilities. She had contacts, people in the media, activists who still believed in the power of real change. She had allies, even if she hadn't known it until now. But it wasn't going to be easy. The foundation was powerful. William Dupri was powerful. And power didn't give up its hold without a fight. "There's one more thing," George said, his voice serious now, the weight of it settling in the room like a storm cloud. "Dupri can't know about this. Not yet. If he does, it's over before it starts. He's got too many resources at his disposal, too many people who are loyal to him. He'll bury us without a second thought." Rebecca took a deep breath, the air thick in her lungs. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the stakes growing higher with every passing second. But she couldn't back down now. Not when she had seen the truth, not when she had felt the weight of it. She had made her choice. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "I'll help you. But we need to be careful, we need to be smart. If Dupri suspects anything—" "We'll move slowly," George interrupted, his voice steady and unwavering. "We'll take our time. We'll build support from the ground up, and we'll make sure we have the right people on our side before we go public. But we need to start now." Rebecca nodded. The first step was always the hardest, but she knew there was no turning back. She wasn't just working for the Dupris anymore. She wasn't just doing her job. She was fighting for something bigger than herself, fighting for the truth. She turned and walked back to her car, the weight of the documents in her hands now a symbol of the fight that lay ahead. She could feel the tension of the night still pulsing in her chest, the excitement and fear blending together into something powerful, something dangerous. As she drove through the dark streets of the city, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that the world had already begun to change. The story was no longer what it had seemed. The truth was starting to surface, and there was no stopping it now. The foundation, the Dupris, their world, it was all about to come crashing down. But Rebecca was ready. She had made her choice. And no matter what came next, she was going to see this through to the end. The end was only the beginning.